pandemic, remember that he also says that now is the time to run harder and make sure we cross the line and reap the rewards of our hard work.
Yeah.
In the first part's quoted, almost never is the second part quoted.
And I do want to ask you about that and about what he means by that, because it's certainly not what we're seeing from governments in the way they're enacting policy around the world. We'll get to that in a moment. But I do want to ask you, who is it up to declare the end of a pandemic?
Well, it's a great question, and really, like, there's no single person that declares the end of a pandemic. So an end of a pandemic is, unexpected outbreak of a disease that crosses borders, spreads rapidly, and has that what's called the exponential spread. So each day, more COVID, more of the disease is spreading than the next day. So the outbreaks are growing. And what we know with COVID, which is a bit challenging in terms of declaring it over, is that, we could see another wave, and we're likely to see another wave, certainly in Europe and the US as they go into winter, likely to see another wave, in the not so distant future. So we're still going to be seeing waves of COVID, and probably waves that have an important impact on health. Whether that's a pandemic or not, I'm not sure, but it certainly is a threat to many people's lives and hospital systems and disability.
So why would the WHO say the end is in sight when the WHO, other members of the WHO also say that it's far from over? It seems like this is a classic case of bad messaging.
I think that although technically the definition of a pandemic and declaring it over, but there's a definition of a pandemic, but declaring it over is more challenging. I think what we do know is from a psychological perspective, if you have a psychological definition of being over COVID, people are well and truly over COVID. So I think it's part kind of reflecting the reality of what people are thinking and feeling about the pandemic. And people just seem no longer willing to take any steps to protect people in the community. And that's part because the threat we face from COVID is less than it was in the past. Thank goodness, with vaccination and to some degree with infection, that we do have improved immunity. But it doesn't mean there's still a real and dramatic impact. A lot of that messaging has been from COVID minimizers that have really, tried to downplay the impact of COVID on people right now. I'm sure some people in the audience might be surprised to know that it's one of the top killers of Australians right now, and likely to be one of the major causes of disability in the near future. So it's not going away. It is here, and it's a serious disease. And maybe we don't see it as a pandemic anymore. Maybe we have to see it like it is, a new major disease that's similar to cancer, something that we need to do something about.
We've heard that the worst of it may be behind us in Australia. How do we know that we're not just sitting in a trough and that things will ramp up again in the future with new variants, for instance?
Well, almost certainly we are sitting in a trough, even with the current variants we have, as our immunity wanes from having had it, from having been vaccinated from it. We will see numbers go up. So we will see another wave. The question is how high it will be and how serious it will be. And that's what no one really knows. And that depends on the virus itself, how it mutates, whether there's a new variant that comes out that's more severe. So, the truth be told, we don't really know what the future is going to hold. We do know there'll be another wave. But, I would entirely agree. It's not 2020. We are in a very different situation than that. And we do need to find ways to live normally with COVID. My issue is that people are simply ignoring COVID. And I think that's a problem. And that's a problem that we'll be living with over the next 3 to 4 years. As they say, as the WHO general says, we have the ability to reap the rewards of all of our hard work in managing COVID. But what my concern is that we just want to get to the end of the pandemic now without doing that work.
Graham, to what extent are people who are vulnerable just over it as well and do want to move on?
Well, the people who are vulnerable that I talk to are definitely not over it. I know people, I have friends who I have not physically met with for 2 years, and I don't expect to meet with them in the near future. People with disabilities and older people. It's very hard to get the current death rate in Australia, and Nancy would have a better knowledge of those figures than I would. But, I'm guessing it's still 40 to 50 people a day across Australia are dying of COVID. So whilst the pandemic, yes, is probably over, I agree that we have to recognise this as a serious disease that we have to live with. I think there's a problem for governments. And the problem for governments is that people, as Nancy said, are psychologically tired of COVID. We've had enough. We want it to finish. We want to be able to travel. We don't want to have to wear masks, but we don't want to have other restrictions. But the reality is, sadly, a bit different. And living with COVID is going to mean some form of restrictions. All the hygiene and sanitising processes we brought in, we need to reinforce those messages. But I think government is voting, as it removes the restrictions, is voting with what most people want, that is for COVID to be over. The risk with that strategy is that we'll get a more serious wave than we would have if we'd kept a bit more vigilant.
Graham, to what extent, Noel, to what extent does this represent an economic hazard?
Well, just before I answer that question, I want Nancy to know that I'm not ignoring COVID, and I've got my mask here for the tram home. And, well, in terms of the economic side of things, I think while the virus is out there, and I'm not a medical expert, but the medical experts, just like Nancy said, tell us that the virus is still out there. It still represents a clear and present danger to the economy, and another wave could do to us just what the waves of 2020 and 2021 did to us. The difference this time around, I suppose, would be that we wouldn't have the money lying around in the bank to bail ourselves out in the same way as we did. We're getting towards $1 trillion in debt, as we know, largely as a result of the money that was spent in responding to those devastating waves economically. So I do well. I don't think it is. If you look at the global headwinds that we're looking at, certainly in terms of what's been happening with interest rates, what's going to happen with interest rates, in all likelihood coming out of the United States, which is going to have a knock-on effect. So I think we're looking at some very difficult conditions economically compared to those super low interest rates that we were looking at prior to the pandemic, and I think the interest rate situation, both locally and globally, is a huge challenge, because it's been well documented that central banks have got to risk pushing big economies like the US into recession if they try and overcorrect or overdo it, trying to get inflation. Inflation, of course, is the other thing that we didn't have to speak of before the pandemic. There was another report which hasn't been less well documented, that came out today out of the University of Melbourne. The Taking the Pulse of the Nation report, the latest instalment, is telling us how people are tightening their belts, they're scrimping and saving, they're changing their shopping habits, their going out habits, and